Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. Today we're going to explore Clarice Lispector's first novel, the novel that made her a sensation, Perto, coração selvagem, Near to the Wild Heart. This also happens to be the first novel that I read by her, and as a matter of fact, it's the one that made me fall in love with Clarice's style. Now Jorge, there is so much that Clarice Lispector wrote that is amazing, right? So I chose this novel in particular. It is in particular very close to my wild heart because I feel like this is a book that I completely entered. It's a book that I immersed myself in and I came out of it a different person. So why? Why was that? The video that you are so kindly watching right now, one of the things that it wants to do is to try to answer to that question. So that's how we're going to approach this thing. Near to the Wild Heart was published in the year 1943, and one of the reasons why it shook the literary world in Brazil was because it was just different. Okay, it was just a different novel. In Latin America at that time, if you look at the context, what was predominant back then was regionalismo or regionalism, the good old novel of the land. So there had, of course, been psychological novels before, right? But the thing is, they didn't have the depth or even the existential power that you can find in something like Near to the Wild Heart. And this was, once again, Clarice Lispector's first novel. This is one of the first great examples of intimismo in Latin American literature. Intimismo, it's like intimate, intimism, I guess we could say, if we wanted to translate that quickly into English. You can compare it, for example, with El Túnel, The Tunnel by Ernesto Sábato from 1948, 5 years after, right? Very different texts that we have right here, but it's a very, very similar mode, this idea of trying to get into the minds of the characters and to explore their inner world. Structure-wise, what we have here is 194 pages, so as you can see, it's not a very long novel at all, but it is very powerful. The story is divided into two parts. The first part has 9 chapters to it, the second one has 10 chapters, so we have quite a good balance right there. The next thing we want to explore is the premise, the plot, the story, whatever you want to call it really, because this is something else what we have right here. That's one of the things that we are going to see. What we have here is the story of a woman named Joanna. She is described, if you look at the back cover right here, as amoral. And I think one of the things that they were trying to do with that was to tie her moral stance to the wild heart of the title. So that is something that you can consider there as you approach this story and this character. To me, if you ask me about her and her stance and all that, I would say that she seems to have a very personal, even an almost intuitive, instinctive kind of morality. That's the way that I look at her personally. In the opening pages, what we encounter is sort of like a childhood perspective. We have the character when she was a child, but very soon, as you continue to read, you get into the second chapter, you realize that that is a flashback that she is having. So we meet her first through a memory, which is very interesting, and then we get to the present, the actual beginning of the novel. And in the actual beginning of the novel, what is happening is a waiting. She is waiting for a guy named Otavio. So the novel proper, very interestingly and wonderfully, if you ask me, begins with an absence. It begins with a void right there, a kind of an empty space right there in Joanna's life. So that's how we meet her. Otavio, in turn, has had a fiancée. Her name is Lydia, right? So one of the ways that you could describe Near to the Wild Heart is as one of the most interesting and one of the most original stories of a love triangle that are out there, okay? I don't like to describe it as that because I think there is so much more when you say love triangle, but once again, right there, you could also draw a comparison with The Tunnel, right? The Tunnel, it's also very, very simplistic to say, oh, it's just the story of a love triangle, right? But there are many points of connection right here and also, of course, many differences. Now, we are talking about Clarice Lispector. So, you know what is much, much more important than plot, premise, story, or whatever you want to call it? Of course, style. Okay, we're talking about Clarice, we need to talk about style. Lispector has been compared to Virginia Woolf, as you may know. I am sure that you have heard that because many critics have drawn that comparison between the two. I think it's an apt comparison. even if there was no direct influence. Because one of the things that happens here is that we don't really have a lot of action. Okay, we don't have action, or at least what we could say is maybe that the action happens inside. It's a kind of an inner emotional feelings type of action that we have right here, because Lispector is concerned primarily with the exploration of those emotional states, those feelings, the inner landscapes. That's what I like to call it. And hold on to those couple of words right there, because we're going to come back to that in a minute and explore it a little bit more in depth. Her style is poetic, it is oniric, it is absolutely subjective on the one hand, but also, I would say, completely relatable. Okay, it's the kind of subjective style that you read and you can relate to. I was thinking about her purposes, her goals as a writer, her approach, and it almost seemed to me that her purpose, her main purpose, was to avoid cliches at all costs. It seems that this is a writer who set out to do that, and let me tell you, I think that she completely succeeded in all of the things that I have read by her, not only in this novel. So that's one thing that I really admire about her. So I told you we're going to focus on style. First thing I want to talk about, the first one that I want to mention, is the fact that this is a very sensuous novel. And you're going to realize as soon as you start reading it, because in the very first chapter, the very beginning, we get an explosion of the senses. Primarily visual and auditive, I would say, elements, but I would also call them like stimuli directly, because this is a very stimulating, a very exciting, literally speaking, novel, and a very exciting story, even if not much happens. I'm going for the literal meaning right there. This makes perfect sense to me, the whole visual, auditory elements, because we are talking about the world of childhood, right? We begin this story with the perspective of childhood, which is the time that we are so open to things. We're just open to everything around us because everything is new, everything is fresh. And actually, let me repeat that word. I would say that if I had to describe Clarice Lispector's world, it is a world that is so fresh, just like that song by Kool and the Gang. I think, that sense of wonder that we have as children, that is what you get right here from the beginning of the novel, and also throughout this thing. It's a sort of combination between fascination and perplexity. That's how I would describe that sense of wonder. You're fascinated by things, and you're also perplexed. You're trying to make sense of things. Another element of style, instead of focusing on plot, inner landscapes. Okay, as I told you before, we're going to focus on this a little bit, so here we are. I think we could call everything that she's doing, or much of what she's doing, the mode in which the story is narrated. We could call it interior monologue, we could call it stream of consciousness. That would be appropriate. But I think, that what Clarice does is so personal that I don't really feel like using those overused terms that we associate with so many other things and so many other authors that are not exactly in the same mode, I would say. It's a very different, so this is a very personal thing, very personal style. At the beginning, especially when you start reading the novel, you're going to notice, or maybe not, but and this is part of the point, that there's a very seamless, I would say, transition between the first person narration and the third person narration. So you don't realize it and you're in a different place. You begin third person and then all of a sudden you're in the mind of this character. And Lispector, let me tell you, she is really ambitious. Those feelings, those emotions that you experience sometimes and you're like, this is just beyond words. This transcends words. I can't put it into words because it goes so far beyond that. Well, that is exactly what she is trying to convey sometimes, and most of the time in her writings. She doesn't go for the small, the realistic goals. She goes for the big stuff right here. And the result, I would describe it as a kind of relatable abstractness. As I was saying before, it's very subjective, but at the same time it's relatable. You can't quite explain it, but when you read it, you go like, yes, that is a very good way of putting it. I experienced that so much, not only in this novel, once again, but throughout the work of Clarice Lispector. It seems that she's thinking, if language is imprecise, if words are inadequate even, why not try anyway? It's going for that goal. It's like kind of like shooting an arrow, If the target is really, really far away, you're not going to hit the target, but you're still going to go for the target. That's still going to be your goal. Your goal is not going to be, I'm just going to try to go halfway. Because if you try to go halfway, then maybe you just go a quarter of the way. If you still aim for that target, even though it's so far away that you're not going to hit it, Maybe you'll get halfway, a little bit more, and you'll be happy with that. But you're still going for that difficult target. That's exactly, I think, what Clarice does when she narrates. So let me read you some samples right here, because I think with Clarice it really helps to have the words that she uses. And the one that I want to begin with is on page 59. And this is a very interesting and very important also mirror scene. So this is really Lacanian, if you want to look at it that way. When I surprise myself in the depths of the mirror, I get a fright. I can hardly believe that I have limits, that I am cut out and defined. I feel scattered in the air, thinking inside other beings, living in things beyond myself. When I surprise myself at the mirror, I am not frightened because I think I am ugly or beautiful. It is because I discover I am of a different nature. After not having seen myself for a while, I almost forget that I am human. I forget my past, and I am as free from end and awareness as something merely alive. Look at that texture, okay? Listen to that, it's just amazing. There's another part where we encounter one of my favorite topics, the topic of being split into two. This idea that we are more than an individual self. We have different facets, right? We are multifaceted. This is once again on page 69. Then she knew that she was drained and for the first time suffered because she really had split into two, each part facing the other, watching her, wishing for things that the other could no longer give. In truth, she had always been two, the one that had a slight idea that she was, and the one that actually was, profoundly. It was just that until then, the two of them had worked together and couldn't be told apart. Now the one that knew she was worked on her own, which meant that the woman was being unhappy and intelligent. She tried in a last-ditch effort to invent something, a thought, to distract herself. Useless. All she knew how to do was live. This is once again, typical. That's the style that Clarice Lispector is known for, and if you have read her, you recognize that, even if you have not encountered this novel at this point, at least. The following thing that I want to share with you is towards the end of the novel, and I wanted to let you know that as you continue to read this novel, you're going to notice that it gets deeper. Okay, the texture of the prose, once again, it gets much deeper, much more abstract, I would say. It's still relatable, it's still intelligible, but it's like when you're reading, Dante's Divine Comedy, you begin in the Inferno with very physical stuff, and then when you get to the Paradiso, it's like very ethereal, That's sort of what I felt, how I felt when I was reading this text. So the one on page 183, this is what it says. Dear God, how sweetly she sank into the incomprehension of herself, and how even more so she was able to let herself go with the firm, soft ebb, and return. She would reunite with herself one day, without the hard, solitary words. She would weld herself and be once again the mute, brusque, strong, wide, unmoving, blind, living sea. And by the way, I chose that one because it ends with this image of the sea. The sea is a very important recurring image in this novel. While I was reading it, I thought of that poem by Swinburne, The Triumph of Time. It's a poem from 1866, but the idea here is this whole notion of the sea as a mother, right? I will go back to the great sweet mother. That's what the poem says. The sea supposedly where all life came from, right? This source of life, this great mother. So we have a mother image right here, very important for this text. Father figures also very important here. So something to look out for right there in terms of images from the novel. Let me say a couple of things about the title, then I'm going to share with you some criticism, and then we'll go into the bottom line, my impressions kind of place for this video. So as you may know, the title, Near to the Wild Heart, and as you will know if you read the novel, because you have an epigraph right here, comes from A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by, of course, James Joyce. It was Clarice's friend, Lucio Cardoso, who actually recommended or suggested that she titled the novel with this phrase from Joyce's great novel. Because of that, there was a downside to that. Inevitably, critics began to sort of compare Clarice's style to the style of James Joyce. And you can still read criticism that does that. You are also going to find many connections. Okay, if you read Portrait of the Artist and this one, of course, there are many connections, especially at the beginning of the novel, because we begin with the image of childhood. If you've read the novel by James Joyce, you remember that childish type of style at the beginning. So there are many connections right there when we hear about Joanna's childhood. But Lispector claimed that she had not read James Joyce by the time that she published Near to the Wild Heart. She was, by the way, 23 years old when this novel was published. She said that she read Joyce afterwards. Now, Jorge, you say she claims, okay? What does that mean? Does that mean that you don't believe her? You know, I'm going to say that I actually do believe her. For one reason, let me go with a cliche right here. Great minds think alike, right? And there are many connections in literature, sometimes between authors that had no way of reading each other. They were not aware, sometimes even, of each other. But the other thing that I want to say is that as you enter the really dark world that is this novel, you're going to realize also that there is so much more to this than just, you know, the style of James Joyce or anything that we could describe that way. This is a very different text. Okay, so maybe superficially, especially at the beginning of both texts, we could establish a connection. We could also speak of Bildungsroman maybe, or anti-Bildungsroman, however you want to look at this one. But that's basically as far as it goes. Now, do you know what really actually inspired Lispector to write? We know this from her own words. That is Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse. So maybe that's another text that we should look at when we want to compare her work with that of other authors. Now, let's look at some criticism here. I have an essay here by Earl E. Fitz, by the way, somebody who studied Clarice Lispector quite a lot. You're going to find a lot of essays by him on her work. This is the one that is titled Freedom and Self-Realization, Feminist Characterization in the Fiction of Clarice Lispector. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to share with you very briefly the overall theme of Clarice Lispector's work. So I think this is great because you could take it as a kind of an introduction to her work and then decide whether you agree or not, of course. But he says, all of Lispector's now famous themes, the essential isolation of each human being, the failure of language to free us from our solipsistic existences, and the ineffable essence of human experience, derive directly from an underlying preoccupation with what we do and how we verbalize it, with the uncertain relationship between words, science, and reality, experience. So I think that is great. You know, that's the first thing that I wanted to share with you. And the other one, also very important right here, is one of the key ideas that Clarice Lispector's approach to characterization is so different that this is one of the reasons why many critics have leveled at her work the criticism that her characters are not clearly delineated. You know, they don't seem like human beings. Many people will say something like that. Well, Fitz, this is the way that he responds to that criticism. He says that the characters, they live poignantly and courageously in a ceaseless process of becoming, in the ebb and flow of their moments of personal vision and truth, constantly confronting both other people and their own internal sense of reality, and regressing as often as they advance. Lispector's characters remind us of those in Nathalie Sarraud's novels. That is, they are not so much three-dimensional entities to be described in terms of size, shape, age, or appearance, as they are states of mind that are first traced out by the author through a web of nuance, subtle verbal plays, and interlocking imagery, and then contemplated as though parts of a prose poem by the reader. So that's the type of characterization that we have right here. This is modern type of presenting the characters. You know, if you look at Rayuela, Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar, does La Maga have blue eyes or green eyes, black hair, blonde hair? And, honestly, I don't remember. I don't think she is described, but if she is, I don't really remember. It doesn't matter, you know. But we know La Maga, you know, we understand this figure of La Maga, and that's all that matters right here. So the next thing I have is I just want to share with you my impressions on the overall novel. As I said before, this is a novel that just cast a spell on me. Okay, that's just the easiest way that I can put it. And it's the kind of novel that you read and you find it so original that you go, this, you know, this is the way that I would like to write, especially as a writer, right? Reading it as a reader is a thing, but I read it also as a writer. And if there's one author that I cannot see suffering from anxiety of influence, that is Clarice Lispector. Okay, and I mean, maybe she did. Okay, I have no idea. I don't know. But I personally don't see any reason why she should have had any anxiety of influence. And that, I think, is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons, why so many readers connect to her and find her work to be amazing, because her voice is her voice. What she absorbed, she obviously absorbed something, because we all have. She mentioned Steppenwolf, right? There must have been others. But what she absorbed, she just made her own. You know, she is not channeling anyone. And that's what makes her great, too. So as a bottom line, what I want to say is that I always recommend to anybody that asks me for recommendations about Lispector's work that they begin with Near to the Wild Heart, because with this novel you can see, you can visually, it's palpable that she was amazing from the very start, from the very first novel that she published. It's not good for a first novel. This is excellent, period. Okay, so it's really, really that good. It's the one that actually got me started reading Lispector. And I also think that one of the reasons, why I recommend this one to begin with is because I feel that if you read this one first, you are also going to be better equipped to enjoy the novels that came after this one, which are rather complex. They are more complex than this one in many ways. So once again, just like Virginia Woolf, Clarice Lispector is one of those authors whose purposes, whose narrative goals, I feel that we need to understand very clearly before we can get to a point where we can enjoy their works fully. Of course, the first time that I read this, I did not get as much out of it as this time, knowing a little bit more about her. But I think it's important. It's important to understand the purpose, the goals. And this is just her introduction. It's kind of like that business card that people give you to introduce themselves. With this novel, she's saying, hello, my name is Clarice Lispector and I am about to blow you away. So I highly recommend that you begin with this one if you have not read her. If you have already read her, then by all means, read this one, because I think there is much here that is going to stay with you and that is going to change you, both as a human being, as a reader, and if you're a writer, as a writer too. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. I am always happy to read them and to respond to them. Those were my 2 cents on Near to the Wild Heart, Clarice Lispector's first and wonderful novel. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.